Migrating from .NET Framework to .NET 8 with Philip Japikse.
The Azure DevOps podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm serving companies building mission-critical software systems. Quick announcement, we're in the second full year of my architect forums. Sign-ups for the next session are up. You can find the link in the show notes. But if you lead a software team and you're looking to collaborate with other peers who are also lead architects leading their teams, then you can just sign up for that. And that's totally free, a community of peers learning and mentoring each other. And for those who are looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, you can just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. My guest today on the show is a returning guest from show number 230, Philip Japikse. He's an international speaker, a Microsoft MVP, an ASPInsider, MCSD, PSM, PSD, PST, all the letters and acronyms and certifications. He's a passionate member of the developer community. Phil has been working with .NET since the first betas of .NET. He's been developing software for over 35 years and heavily involved in the Agile community since 2005, as well as a professional Scrum Trainer. He's taken over the best-selling Pro C# books and has done several of those from Apress, and the latest one is Pro C# 10. And he's also the president of the Cincinnati .NET Users Group, and you can find that at cinnug.org. Also, the Cincinnati Software Architect Group, and he co-hosted the Hallway Conversations packet. You can find that at hallwayconversations.com. He founded and runs CincyDeliver conference at CincyDeliver.org, and he volunteers for the National Ski Patrol. And during the day, Phil works as the CTO for Pintas Mullins, and he always enjoys learning new tech and is always striving to improve his craft. Phil, welcome back to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Hey, when you read the bio, I realize it's a little too long.
No.
It works fine for print, but maybe I need to have the abridged version.
Well, you've done a lot of stuff. I mean, there's a lot there. So I think it's always good for people to understand who they're listening to, because, the number of people who were actively building software in the 90s and still doing it today is kind of getting smaller.
Yeah. One of these days I'll just retire, but I'm too stupid to, or enjoying myself too much. One of those two, or maybe both.
Right. Well, for those people who didn't see episode 230, which we'll include a link to that in the show notes, we dove in deep about C# 10 and whatnot. But for those who didn't hear it and maybe haven't seen you at a conference or in one of the Cincinnati groups, can you kind of back up and highlight some of the high points of what led you down the path that you are now, and one of the most experienced developers out there, because you've moved into leadership, but you're still hands-on coding, whereas there's a lot of people our age that kind of move away from programming too. So what kind of pushed you in your career direction?
So for me, it's always been about, well, I'll be frank, it's about winning, right? So when I was very young, my father, who was an exec with Procter & Gamble, brought a computer home, and it was an NPM machine, text only. And the mandate was, everybody above a certain level, Procter & Gamble, had to have a computer, and he never turned the thing on. So I did, right? And so I would copy the games out of the magazines and then figure out a way to win. So I don't know if you remember the game Sub Hunt, but I actually introduced the nuclear depth charge into Sub Hunt if you knew the right keystroke. So I always beat my friends in the game. And it was, how do I solve a problem, right? How do I use tech? And so fortunately, it came fairly natural to me. And then went to school for that, started my own company, been consulting for a long time. And as I worked my way up the leadership ladder and did a lot more sales, I realized that it's not about the tech, it's about solving a problem, right? And really understanding what the needs are, what the problem is, and then using tech to solve that problem if it applies. But there's also been plenty of times, and sometimes we forget this, where you just have to sit back and say, that's not a technical problem, right? That's a process problem, or it's a human interaction problem, or something else. And throwing all the software at it that you can think of isn't going to solve it. And I can't get away from getting in and doing the work. I had some free time over the weekend, and the family was all out of the house, and I was just here with the dogs, and pulled up our Azure DevOps board and saw some PBIs I wanted to knock out, and spent about 8 hours programming yesterday because, so for those of you who don't know, yesterday was Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
I won't tell you what Sunday because we don't date these things. But yeah, so I just, spent the day, back door was open, nice cool breeze coming in, and cranked out a bunch of code for 8 hours because I was solving problems. I enjoy it, right? And I also enjoy leading the people and mentoring. And I won't say leading. What I do is I get rid of roadblocks, right? I make it so that the people that work for me, it's not so much that they work for me, it's that I hope to make it so they can do their work unencumbered.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I like to put it. But
yeah. Well, in sports, there's definitely these positions that are involved with the professional sports team and are on the field with the players, even if they're not personally like the quarterback throwing every ball and whatnot. The coaches are on the sidelines, and not a day goes by where you don't touch the field, you don't touch the ball. Versus, the people who are maybe keeping the books and the accounting for the sports team. I mean, that's a very different way to be involved with a sports team. And yeah, there's something about like being on the field in the game.
Well, and it's absolutely right, but also it's really hard to make sure that you're providing the most effective environment for your people to work in if you're not in the environment doing the same thing, right?
Yeah.
It dawned on me recently that there's some tools that I have on my machine that my employees didn't have, and they were struggling, and they finally got one of them to talk about it. I'm like, oh, wait, what?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I got the tools, and they're like, oh my gosh, it's so much easier with this particular tool. And it's, if I'm not doing the same work, there's no way I can make sure that they're operating at their peak efficiency.
Yeah.
And to be frankly, I want them to be happy, right? That's first of all. And if you got the right tools and you're not dealing with a bunch of red tape, people tend to be happy.
Right. That's right. You have to find out the best tools, get them, learn how to use them well, and then use them.
Yeah.
So one thing that you've done a lot of is working on software in .NET framework version 1 to 4.x and migrating applications over that jump between 4.x and then 5, 6, 7, 8. And there's a lot more. Well, there's a whole mess of software out there that's kind of now, is it fair to describe it as stuck on 4.8?
It is absolutely fair to describe, because depending on how you wrote your 4.8, you could be very well stuck. And we're dealing with that right now.
Yeah, it's like you can upgrade pretty easy from 4 to 4.7, then 4.8, but then you're then there's a big old jump to get it beyond that. For those who maybe started programming after .NET 5 came out and don't know like the history of how that came about and why it's a jump, what makes it a little bit more difficult than just another version?
And when you say .NET 5, what you mean is .NET Core, right? Because it was briefly named ASP.NET 5, but us old timers, we sometimes forget. It's really a paradigm shift going from, and the names are a struggle, not a struggle necessarily, but .NET Framework is what we're calling the legacy, or Microsoft has named the legacy .NET that you and I grew up on, or not grew up on. We were already old when it came out, but that's the web forms, WCF, those frameworks, ASP.NET MVC, ASP.NET, in early days of the WPF and everything. And so that's .NET Framework. So then this thing came out, and then she called ASP.NET 5, and it wasn't just revolutionary or evolutionary, and I don't know what the word is that's bigger than that. They basically said, we're going to throw away everything that we've had before, and we're going to start over. We're going to take all these learnings that we have, and it's we being Microsoft. We've learned a lot from building all these frameworks for all these many years, and we're going to, presumably do it right this time. And so they said, it's a whole new thing. We're going to call it .NET Core, which was a good name for it. And the presumption was that there was this bridge called .NET Standard that could kind of play with framework as well as .NET Core. But we're going to iterate, and we're going to iterate very fast. And one of the things about .NET Core, or .NET Now, as it's called since .NET 5, which there is a .NET 5, but again, a bad name, right? Because it went from 4.8 to ASP.NET 5, which was the working title, to .NET Core. Now we have a .NET 5. They dropped the core name. So again, the naming is just a hot mess. But Microsoft has said, there's no guarantee that we're not going to break things in the next release, which also makes it hard to stay current, but more important to stay current, because there's things that were introduced in the early days of .NET Core that it didn't work optimally, we'll say. And so Microsoft said, yeah, too bad, so sad. We're going to break a bunch of stuff. And 3.1 had a ton of breaking changes, especially in the EF core, right? And then those are few and fewer between. But even with, the release of .NET 5, and I still call it .NET Core 5, just again to get that whole clarity around it. Because I realized I said, no, there wasn't a .NET 5, and you're looking at me funny, because I was thinking of 4.8 to 5.
Yeah.
With EF Core, they brought this new thing in that significantly sped up single line updates, but at the cost of, there's some breaking changes based on certain things. So you got to stay current, right? And you got to read up, and you got to pay attention to what's going on. Spent a lot of time on Microsoft.Learn. Look at the breaking changes. Microsoft has gotten so much better at documenting. It used to be docs at ASP.NET, but now it's Microsoft Learn. And every version, they'll say, what's new, breaking changes, and you got to go through that. But yeah, so it's a chasm. It really is, to get from framework to, and now for the sake of clarity, I'm going to call it .NET Core, even though it's now .NET 8 is the official name of it. And I suppose you want me to talk about some of those problems.
Well,
right? Is that where we're headed?
I remember. Well, I mean, this whole show is about migrating, migrating an application from one to another. I remember had Scott Hunter on the show, and he was kind of relating some of the internal discussions way back when, and when they started saying, okay, we've got an entire developer ecosystem, and you have to have the Windows operating system for any of it to do anything. We've got to figure out a way that that's not an absolute constraint. And I think a whole bunch of stuff has unraveled since then.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the initial, ASP.NET 5 was initially being designed for Windows Nano, right? To get rid of the dependence on IIS and things like that. And it really has broadened a bunch of stuff so that you can develop on a Mac, you can develop on Unix, you can deploy to Unix, you can deploy anywhere and develop anywhere. But that being said, there's a lot of functional stuff that is different, right? And things that just can't be carried forward or won't be carried forward. one of the biggest problems that you have is if you are, well, let me back up and let me make this statement. If you have a .NET Framework app and it's working and there's no real problems with it, it's meeting the business needs, maybe it's not the best, but it's reliable and it works, don't mess with it.
Mm-hmm.
You do not have to upgrade. .NET 4.x will be supported as long as there is a Windows operating system, right? Because it's built into Windows.
Yeah.
So you're not going to be in a situation where they're going to pull the rug out from under you and all of a sudden, your app stop working.
Mm-hmm.
That's never, well, I won't say never. It's not going to happen in our lifetimes, right? Because Windows is not going away.
Yeah.
That being said, if you're not starting every new project in, and I'm going to say .NET Core 8, then you're doing yourself and your firm a huge disservice,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
It's light years ahead of what we can do in Framework. So file a new project, always do it .NET. I'm going to call it .NET Core. Old projects, you have to sit back and you have to look on the things that developers hate to hear, but that old ROI, right? What is the return on investment for rebuilding this thing? And more often than not, those web form apps aren't performing the way they need to, right? The business has changed. Those were written, 15, 20 years ago. A lot of them are. That's what I inherited at the firm when I came in. We had an intake app and we have a case management app. And the intake app, they're both built in web forms and a really horrible architecture within it. And, my mandate from the CEO was we need to modernize, right? We not just because we need to be on the shiny tech, but this isn't meeting our business anymore,
Mm-hmm.
right? So now we have to figure out how do we get from point A to point B. Now, let's take the easy way first. Let's say you have a very well architected ASP.NET MVC application or a Web API 2.1 application. And by well architected, your views just have what they're supposed to have, right? Some razor code, some markup, some CSS. Your controllers are very lightweight. You're calling into different services, things like that. You're using things like dependency injection, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you got this beautifully architected app that's almost not even worth having a show about because it's super easy to move that to .NET Core. Literally, it's file new project, ASP.NET web service. That's going to give you the plumbing infrastructure. You're going to have to learn how the program.cs is different now, especially with top level statements. But for the most part, you can clipboard inherit your controllers, your views, your models out of your old application into the new application. Now, you're not going to be taking advantage of all the new stuff, but it's going to work for the most part, right? You're going to find some minor tweaks. Same thing with Entity Framework code. If you're using EF6 and you're using, and I hate the term, but code first, right? So in other words, non-designer, right? So you've got your entities, you've got your relationships, you're building around an application DB context. That also picks up pretty well and goes to EF core, right? There's a few things that you have to worry about, but you're going to get compiler warnings for them. There's some attributes that change names and things like that. And again, you're not going to be taking advantage of all the new things, but you're going to be up in a new framework and you're going to be inherently faster just because you are in .NET Core, right? It is that much faster of a rendering and running engine than framework. That's a happy path, right? Woohoo, we can cancel the show. We're done. Let's talk about the not happy stuff. Web forms does not exist in .NET Core, probably never will, right?
Mm-hmm.
Designer in any framework, right? It was a horrible idea to begin with. I won't say horrible. That's really harsh.
It was a point-in-time idea.
It was a point-in-time idea that solved a problem at the time. The problem at the time was a lot of developers in the Microsoft ecosystem didn't really understand how databases work and didn't understand how to build out an entity data model using entities and relationships. And so we got this canvas where you can drag and drop stuff, right? And round trip engineer. So it served a purpose at the time, just like web forms served a purpose, right? It's a leaky abstraction of HTTP, but gave the developer the impression it was stateful. Well, those things are not being carried forward and don't exist. So now what do we do? How do we get this old archaic app into the new framework in the best possible manner? And I'm going to say there's no one answer, right? I'm going to be the architect, say it depends. But let's go through the depends, right? First and foremost, anybody who says we're going to completely rewrite this app in a new technology without making changes is wasting their time and the company's money. Right? If you're just going to rewrite the app, there's no point in doing it. What we found when we rewrote the intake app, and we built the re-intake app, we built it from scratch in .NET Core. Started in 3.1 and we finished in 6, and it took 3.5 calendar years, right? And now that wasn't a whole team of people working on it for 3.5 years. It was, we started pre-COVID, COVID hit, lots of other changes hit. Ramp up, ramp down on staff. I was consulting at the time. I was in the CTO role as a consultant, had a bunch of my employees in a consulting company. We changed staffing. And so 3 calendar years later, we released this app, and we see an immediate boost in productivity from the staff because the app is so much faster, more responsive. But more importantly, we rebuilt it for the business needs. So you always have to go into this app revitalization or app modernization with, I'm not just bringing it to a current technology, I'm going to bring it up to the current business needs, right? So there's always going to be change involved. So you always have to go through the whole design phase, right? Hopefully you're doing it in an agile manner. And I say a little agile, where you're actually collaborating and working together. And I'm sure you've done a ton of shows on that, so I'm not going to go into that. But that's the right way to do it. But it's going to take a ton of time to rebuild this thing from scratch, because you cannot have a web form app or any .NET framework app and a .NET Core app or .NET 8 app running in the same web server process, right? So if you're on IIS for both, it's going to be different URLs. Now, you could play games with the URLs and make them look the same, but they have to be different web servers. Plus, you could also use Nginx or Apache or anything else for your .NET 8 app, so you don't even have to be on IIS. So then you have that problem of, okay, how do we get them to move over? Well, we did the Big Bang Theory with, am I allowed to say that? They didn't copyright that term, did they? Hopefully not, the TV show.
Who would
if
they
not,
be?
edit it out.
The
We'll call
TV
it something
show.
different. But we'll call it ta-da development, right? We went away for 3 calendar years and came back one day and went, ta-da, here's your new software, right? And it was, we wrote it in an agile manner, but we couldn't release any of it, right? Even though it's potentially releasable, because we had to at least get to the point of where the old app was.
Yeah, migrate the data too.
And that was a nightmare. So we walked in with a very poor design for the database. So probably 3 to 5 months of just building data migration scripts and building the tests and the automated tests around all those, right? Because of course the data keeps coming in, and so you have to keep testing it. And they love the app, but I would never do that process again. I would never, unless it's a very small app, I would never go away and say, let's rebuild this. And we were doing sprints and everything else, but we couldn't release anything, right? So we had all this great software, but it wasn't complete enough for intake. And we didn't have a mechanism where we could use old bits and new bits together. And that was a huge mistake, right? And so now what we're addressing it a little differently. What we're doing now, and I still think, so we're 6 months into this, maybe 9 months into this, I still think this is the best way. What we are doing is we're taking our web forms app with the EF6 designer, and in the app itself, we're making the screen enhancements. We're moving to MVC. We're moving to EF6 code first. And, so we're still in the same app, and we're like, and I've got a way of doing it. So I've got the old screen that they're still used to using, and I've got my new screen. I labeled experimental, so nobody gets wound up if it doesn't work exactly right. And so we do A/B testing, or we do a limited test with feature flags, right? And we've got continuous deployment going on. So every time we build, we just have everything feature flagged off so nobody can see it. And then we'll turn it on for the devs so they can test it in staging. And then we turn it on for few key people so that they can test this new screen, right? Still labeled experimental, so the bosses don't see it and go, "What? You moved my cheese, and this is different." And then when the business has really signed off and said, "Hey, this new screen is so much better. It does what we need, and it's faster," then we just one day we'll just switch them, right? And the old screen goes away, and that menu is now replaced with the new screen, which is an MVC5 screen. So we're in the same. The URLs haven't changed, right? And that's really important that you don't change the URL, especially if this is an outward-facing application, right? Inward, an application where only my firm's employees are using it, I might get some head scratching, hey, this URL is different. I'll be like, it's okay. And they're like, all right, whatever, they move on. You do that in the public and you switch URLs, they think they're getting phished or hacked or something, right? So you can't do that. And in this moving to MVC5 and EF6 Designer is actually keeping the URLs the same, but giving them that better experience, redesigning the app as we go, cleaning up the database as we go, right? And so we're doing that database redesign as we're doing this. And I'm going to tell you that's hard, right? Because we're doing this in-place migration of the data, right? So our releases get really hairy at times, especially on the data side. But we're going to end up with, at some point in time, a well-architected MVC5 app with a well-architected data access layer in EF6 code first. And then we're going to do file new project, .NET probably 10 at that time, right? And then we're going to clipboard inherit the stuff over and then start taking advantage of new stuff, right? And I right now I'm completely sold that this is the way to do it.
Yeah.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
One thing that I'm reminded of when I jump into another .NET Framework app again is some of the things that they change that end up being a pretty big shock, like app settings, the config files versus the JSON, and then the CS proj files. I mean, just the whole format that those are organized in. It looks like it's totally different, but what are the things that really are different?
So certainly I am spoiled with all the updates that came into .NET Core and .NET. And the big one that you talked about is configuration, right? So in .NET Core apps, we do have JSON-based configuration, but we also have environmental awareness. So ASP.NET Core apps are looking for an environment variable, ASP.NET Core environment, and it can be one of three predefined ones, right? Development, staging, or production, or you can make up your own local or, staging 2, whatever you want. And then you can have individual configuration settings for those environments, and it just knows to load the right JSON file. So we have in our production apps, we've got, our UI is this way. In staging, we have it load. It knows it's in staging, so it loads a different style sheet. So the background is purple or blue or some really, oh my gosh, this is different.
Yeah. So
they know they're in staging, right? Also, now I'm pointing to a different endpoint for my microservices, or and all this is no code change, right? I set it up in my .NET, my ASP.NET Core application to say, hey, get these values out of the settings file, and then each settings knows its environment. You don't have that in web forms. You kind of do with the web.production.config and the web dot in the web dot
Development.
staging config and development config, but that's really kludgy, and it also requires you to have all of the secrets in those files. And I'm really a big fan of not having application secrets in Git.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, Git is also very against having you the secrets in there, and will yell at you constantly if you do. So what we've done is something a little different. Is we actually have it's a total hack, but in our app config section of the web config, we actually mimic this where we have development SSL. Right? We'll have properties that begin with the word development or staging, or we don't have prod because we copy that in from the server, but that way the app can mimic that. And so in web forms, I can have it behave a different way if I'm staging versus development versus production.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something that we've hacked our way back into. The options pattern, right? The ability to instantiate an object based on the settings, and the settings that are based on the environment is a huge benefit in ASP.NET Core apps and part of the DI framework. The other thing that we don't have, and you could, I tried, but it was really clunky in web forms, is you don't have DI, right? There's no built-in dependency injection.
Right.
And we tried to add it in, and it was a nightmare. We just said, scrap it. We're not going to do DI in the web forms app. We'll do it on the MVC5 side. So yeah, it's there's no tuples, right? The tuples that we have and the record classes and some of those features that came with C# 10 I use them all the time in my modern apps.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm like, I have to build a whole new class for this.
Right.
Oh my gosh, right? And so that's.
It seems like the changes are only getting bigger. Like if it was just to jump over to .NET 5, well then now you have certain changes. But then 6 changed some stuff, and 7 changed some stuff, and 8 changed some stuff. Not just like the C# language features being more available, but I'm thinking in the time between, I guess, .NET Core 2.2, which maybe that was the first one that I started to trust just subjectively. But on up to now, in the same time, the Azure cloud is very different. And now, like pushing things to Azure container apps, well, you can't even use JSON configuration files anymore because this is just not a thing with container images. Environment variables are the way when you're running it in a Kubernetes backed service.
Right. And that's so we're not doing containerization with the firm right now because honestly
it's new. Sure.
We don't have enough complexity.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, literally our 2 main apps are forms over data. And that's not to belittle the applications. They're very complex. It's a law firm, right? And law is crazy complex, but at the end of the day, it's forms over data.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, one is for intake and one for, managing the case once it's been opened. But yeah, it's really difficult to stay current in one set of it. It's even harder, as I'm finding, to stay current and then go back into C#, what are we in, 7.1 and 4.8, and not have these things, right? And I use ReSharper in Visual Studio, and I have to constantly remind ReSharper that I'm not in C# 10 or 12, and that the suggestion you have will not compile.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that's another reason why I say the sooner you start this transition, like once you make the decision that this app is not going to live in .NET Framework, then don't delay. You've got to start making your plan. There's another plan you can do, which I didn't really talk about, and that is parsing it out, right? So let's say you've got, and again, our apps are, our intake is basically a single page application. It's a little more complex than that. Case management, you got your case, and then you got the ancillary things from that. But it's not like we've got this module and that module and this other module and all these modules. But if you do have something that could be broken into modules, here's another option that can get you modernized faster and can take advantage of some of this new technology, for example, like containers and whatnot. But let's say you have a finance module in your application, and you're like, this is the one that's worse. You don't have to rebuild the whole application, right? Pull that out, right? And rebuild that, right? And do kind of to-do development. If you don't have the time to go from web forms to MVC to .NET Core with your finance module, maybe that's one that you do to-do development. Or if it's different enough that you really can't do that gradual migration, then you pull out that module, and we're going to rebuild this module. We're going to make it meet our needs now, and we're going to put it in a container. We're going to put it behind a different URL. And an advantage there of using containers is you can have one URL, and then you can have some intelligence behind to render the right content, right? So if it is an external-facing app, you don't have those people shocked or scared because the URL is changing. One thing I want to be very clear about, while it took 3 calendar years for us to rebuild our intake app, and again, that wasn't 100% development time, it was just calendar time, it would have taken longer to do the web forms to MVC5 to .NET route, right? The difference being is that with what I'm doing in our case management side of the house is they're seeing immediate benefit, right? Not all the benefit you get with full-on .NET Core or .NET 8, but they're seeing benefit of the redesign, of the updated, matching the new requirements, a faster app because, we're using code first and we're taking advantage of some of the things that we can do, and retiring the web forms, which are old and slow. So, these are all trade-offs, and these are things you have to think about. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
I don't feel like I answered your question.
There's so much here, and kind of as we wrap it up, I'm thinking there's certainly .NET Core on up to .NET 8 issues, and then there's just the architectural options of a renovation. When you're taking an existing system, and regardless of you're making some technology jumps that require you to change some stuff, and it all seems to come back to dependencies. It's like, oh, you know what? Whatever I'm going to doesn't have access to that particular dependency, so I need to break this up, and it's all the same questions. Do I keep in the to-do state or to-be state? Do I keep everything running in the same memory space like it always has been, or do I chop some things up and move some parts before and then kind of stitch it together back visually for the user? And just a ton of things. But for the developers that maybe haven't done a whole lot of .NET 5 through 8, are there any particular resources that are your favorites for them to really start digging in?
Well, there's always my book, Pro C# 10 with .NET 6.
Yep.
Which I'm sure you'll link to in the bio. And I want to talk about that a little bit. So the book is 1,700 pages, and the first half of it is a deep dive into C# and the .NET framework, and the second half of it is really application building, right? It's you're building out a set of applications, starting with the data access layer, and then using ASP.NET Core to build a website using MVC, and then the same website again using Razor pages, and then building a RESTful service on top of the data access layer. And there's several decisions that went into not updating it for C# 11 or C# 12, and one of them is it's a ton of work. And while there are changes, and there's significant changes between C# 10 and .NET 6 going up to C# 12 and .NET 8, they're not 1,700 pages worth of changes. And to update, that size of a book every year, frankly, it beat me, right? I'm defeated. I can't do it every year. I thought about doing one for C# 12, but there's so much out there. If you understand foundationally things like solid programming and dependency injection and what object-oriented really means. And then you get a really good understanding of what .NET Core, and I'm going to still use the term core, brings to the table. The delta between my last book and where we are currently isn't all that big. But if you're not a book reader, there's lots of, no, I don't have any. Well, there's programming with Palermo. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about that, right? You've got your channel. But the other thing is get to a user group, right? Find some people in your hometown. I run one here in Cincinnati. I can't recall if you all are still involved one in your hometown, but there's plenty of .NET user groups out there, and find some like-minded people that maybe you just go and do a code and coffee once a month, where you just sit in a coffee shop and sling code and talk about ideas. Really, the best way I think to learn is to learn with other people, because they're going to bring ideas into the fold that you hadn't thought about. But more importantly, like if you're pair programming and you think something's a great idea and you're doing it live with somebody looking at your code, first of all, you're like, now that I'm talking this out loud, maybe it's not such a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
And then your partner's going like, I have no idea what you just typed, right? And so you get this checks and balances. It's so much better than a code review to do pair programming, because it's a 100% code review as it's being written.
Yeah.
And you can shape it. And that's what don't do this in isolation, right? I know people are like, oh, I'm going to be a developer, so nobody will ever talk to me. But that is such an outdated idea, right? This is a team sport, right? And just find yourself a good team, right? And I'm not just talking about code workers. I'm talking about people. There's online communities too. I'm a little older, so I'm not in the Discord crowd. But there's plenty of communities out there where you can get in and get some pair programming going and get some synergistic learning with others.
Yeah, good advice. Good advice. We'll definitely include all the links to the things we talked about in the show notes. And Phil, thanks for coming back on the podcast and sharing with us your experience in moving .NET Framework apps, up and beyond, up to the current version.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And it's I know I made it sound like it's a lot of work, and it is a lot of work, but I just want to close with this. When you get done, and now you've taken this thing that was really kind of a burden on your business, and now people enjoy working with it, and they're much more productive, and you see the benefits from it, that makes it worth it, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody can be proud that, hey, we built this, right? And they're not complaining. When they're complaining about things, they're not complaining about the app anymore, right? They're complaining about the lunch or traffic or something else. And that's a win, right? And let that be your motivator.
Yeah, good points. Good points. Awesome. Well, it was a great topic. Thanks again, Phil.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
My pleasure. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.